I'm Laura Jarrett, NBC News' senior legal correspondent and co-anchor of Saturday Today. And today, we're going to talk about covering the courts. We cover the legal system even from the earliest days of a case because so often in journalism, we're covering people who are in the seats of power, and we're supposed to be holding institutions accountable. And oftentimes, legal cases take a really long time to work their way through the system. So even if someone is charged, it might be years before they actually go to trial, but that person might be running for office or have some other role in government that's really important. And so it's important to cover it from day one because you don't know how it's going to shake out years from now. There are no prerequisites to doing this job well other than the ability to read and to listen and to write well. Being able to distill information quickly and accurately is the most important part of this job. Not a legal degree, not a journalism degree. You just have to be able to do it fairly and quickly and well. The big difference between federal courts and state courts are the type of cases that you're hearing and the type of judges. For federal courts, it's not every single type of case that would come through a federal court. It has to involve perhaps an interpretation of a federal law or the U.S. Constitution, or say someone commits a crime that happens to go across state lines. That's a federal case. State cases are just localized to their jurisdiction, and it could be civil crimes or criminal cases, but they're much more localized. Federal cases are much, much broader. The great thing about covering state courts is oftentimes now they're televised, which is unlike federal court, which is never televised.
All right.
For instance, we're following a case about the former president in Georgia. All of those are on the judge's YouTube channel, which would never have been the case in federal court. That's one of the ways that covering state courts, even though the system is very different, is sometimes actually easier. So I find out about legal news from a variety of different sources, but I have a couple go-to places. Number one is Pacer. Pacer is, think of like a master database for all federal cases. And we now have another thing called Court Listener, which basically scrapes all the federal court dockets to get all of the cases we could want delivered to our inbox. And so I sign up for all of the cases that I'm covering every day here at NBC News. And then as soon as something happens, say a judge just issued an order, I immediately get it in my inbox. Anybody can get a Pacer account, anybody can follow Court Listener. But the big thing to recognize is that Court Listener, Pacer, all of these databases assume a basis of knowledge, and so it does take a little bit of practice to get used to using them. They're not necessarily intuitive, but once you get the hang of it, it's pretty easy. Now, covering state courts is an entirely different matter. Every state court has its own system, it's not centralized, so that's completely scattershot. Sometimes, if you're lucky, you get a document ahead of time before it's been made public, and that's because the lawyers or other people involved realize that these take a long time to digest, and the coverage will be better if the journalists have it ahead of time. It's because the document is messy or there's a lot to go through, and getting it even like an hour ahead of time can be really, really useful. And the lawyers don't always do this, and when they don't do it, they see that sometimes there's a mad dash and a scramble to try to unpack something that might be a little bit challenging or complicated. As soon as I get a document, especially if it's of something of any significance, I know that I probably don't have a lot of time before we're going to go live with our special report or breaking news coverage of it. And so my first pass is to try to just go through as much of it as possible to digest it. Am I going to be able to read every word? No. Is the audience expecting that I'm going to be able to read every word? Probably not. But the best thing that I can do is also be transparent with the audience about what we're doing. So maybe it means saying something like, the short story is the case is going back to the Supreme Court. We're just getting this right now. It's a lengthy document. It's going to take some time to go through, but here's what we know and here's what we don't know. The first thing to do if you get an enormous document dumped on your desk is to understand what type of document it is. If it's a state court decision, you can typically go to the very end or sometimes in the front to figure out what the ruling is. Hopefully there's some bottom line conclusion from the judge to provide you with a little bit of guidance about what the result is, but not always. And so you have to sort of be very adept at moving quickly through the document to figure out what the result is. The best thing you can bring to cover the courts is a good notepad and a good pen. I've been covering the courts for a long time, and I still don't know shorthand the way that court transcribers do, but I do know that the best thing you could do is to listen for key words or key phrases, because there's not going to be enough time to get everything down word for word. But if you hear a judge say a conclusion or describe the situation, that's something that you're going to want to put forward in your analysis and whatever reporting that you're going to do. And so it's better to get those key moments than getting everything word for word. Every court will have its own rules about electronics. If it's federal court and you're a journalist, sometimes you can bring a laptop. If it's state court, typically you can bring a laptop, your phone, electronics like that. Can you take pictures? Generally, no. Can you take video? Generally not. Absolutely not in federal court. Can you record audio? Generally, no. This is why it's so important to bring a pen and a good notebook. A lot of times you might go into a court hearing expecting one way it's going to turn out or expecting it's going to be sort of mundane. And there have been plenty of times where I walked into court and something completely unexpected happened.
See, I told you the truth. This is your Perry Mason moment.
And you need to be able to react to that in real time and not go in sort of with baked-in assumptions about how it's going to go. And so the best thing to do is to just be aware enough to be able to react to that moment. Covering the courts and legal system is not just about documents. It's not just about pulling documents off of online databases. Fundamentally, it's about people and having relationships. And it's really important, if you're going to cover the courts, to get to know the players, especially lawyers that come through the courts often. It's really important that you be able to have those relationships, have their cell phone number, so that when something happens, you have a source to call. Because oftentimes, we'll get lawsuits or documents before they're actually posted online. And the way you do that is by having a source relationship. Anytime you're covering someone accused of a crime, you have to assume that they're innocent in the same way that the court does. Try to use language that doesn't assume their guilt. We say allegedly if we're talking about crimes that the prosecutor has accused them of, but they haven't yet been convicted. If someone's been convicted, then that's a different story, and we can bake in whatever the jury or the judge decided in our analysis. But if someone's only been accused of a crime, we have to be really careful about that, because the trial might actually prove them innocent. I think the best thing that someone can do if they want to cover the courts is to get in a courtroom and sit through as many trials as possible and talk to people, talk to the lawyers, talk to anybody that you can get your hands on so that you can figure out why they made certain decisions, or if there are terms or things that are confusing, ask people questions. For me, covering the courts is really important and a privilege because somebody's rights are at stake oftentimes. Somebody has a vested interest in the outcome. We're holding people who are in positions of power accountable, and we're holding our institutions accountable.
Count 1, guilty. Count 2, guilty.
The U.S. Constitution set up our system of government in this way, balancing federal and state power. And so being able to go on television every day and talk about that is amazing.